Welcome and thanks for joining me. Before we begin, if you enjoy these stories, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always enjoy reading your comments. Now get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. Long before Rome became an empire that stretched across 3 continents, it was nothing more than a scattering of huts on a hill beside a muddy river. To understand how one of history's greatest civilizations began, we have to go back to a time when the land we now call Italy was covered in forests, marshes, and small tribal villages, each one guarding its own hill, its own river crossing, its own small piece of the world. The river was called the Tiber. It wound its way through a valley surrounded by 7 hills, and it was here, sometime around the 8th century before Christ, that a group of shepherds and farmers began to build something that would eventually change the course of human history. But before we speak of stone walls and marching legions, we should speak of the story the Romans themselves loved to tell about their own beginning. A story of twin brothers, a she-wolf, and a quarrel that would echo through the centuries. According to legend, there once lived a princess named Rhea Silvia, daughter of a king who had been overthrown by his own brother. The usurping brother, fearful that Rhea Silvia might one day bear a son who would reclaim the throne, forced her to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to chastity. But the god Mars, it was said, came to her in secret, and from that union she bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus. When the wicked uncle learned of the babies, he ordered them drowned in the Tiber River. The servant given this cruel task could not bring himself to kill the infants outright. Instead, he placed them in a basket and set them adrift on the river, leaving their fate to the current and to chance. The basket drifted downstream until it caught among the roots of a fig tree near the base of the Palatine Hill. There, the twins were discovered not by a person, but by a she-wolf, who instead of harming them, nursed them as if they were her own cubs. A woodpecker sacred to Mars was said to have brought them food as well, and together the wolf and the bird kept the infants alive until a shepherd named Faustulus found them and took them home to raise as his own. The twins grew up strong and wild, natural leaders among the local shepherds, and when they learned the truth of their birth, they overthrew the false king and restored their grandfather to his throne. But the brothers had grown to love the land where they had been raised, the hills beside the Tiber, and they decided to build a city of their own there. It was in deciding exactly where to build and who would rule it that tragedy struck. Romulus wished to build on the Palatine Hill while Remus favored the Aventine. To settle the dispute, they agreed to look for a sign from the gods, watching the sky for birds, believing that the flight of birds would reveal the will of heaven. Remus is said to have seen 6 vultures first, but Romulus later saw 12. Each brother claimed victory, and the argument grew bitter. In the chaos that followed, Remus was killed. Some stories say by his own brother's hand, others say by a follower of Romulus who could not tolerate the mockery Remus made of the boundary walls his brother had begun to build. Whatever the truth, only Romulus remained, and it was he who gave his name to the new city. Rome was founded according to the old Roman calendar in the year we would now call 753 before Christ. Of course, the true beginnings of Rome were almost certainly far less dramatic than this tale of wolves and vultures and murdered brothers. Archaeologists digging into the layers of earth beneath the Palatine Hill have found traces of small huts dating back to roughly that same period. Simple one-room dwellings made of wood, thatch, and mud. The homes of farmers and herders who lived a modest, difficult life. These early settlers were part of a people called the Latins, one among many tribes scattered across the Italian peninsula, sharing the land uneasily with the Etruscans to the north, the Sabines nearby, and the Greek colonies that had already taken root in the south. It was the Etruscans, in fact, who would shape early Rome more than any legend of wolves ever could. This mysterious civilization, whose language still puzzles scholars today, brought with them advanced skills in engineering, in city planning, in the arts, and in religious ritual. For a time, Rome itself was ruled by Etruscan kings, men who drained the marshy valley between the hills, built Rome's first sewer system, and constructed grand temples where simple shrines once stood. The famous Roman Forum, which would later become the beating heart of the city, its marketplace, its courthouse, its stage for political life, began as nothing more than a swamp that Etruscan engineers learned to tame. For roughly 250 years, Rome was governed by kings, 7 of them according to tradition, beginning with Romulus himself. Each king added something to the growing city. One built its first walls. Another established its religious institutions and calendar. Another expanded its territory through war with neighboring tribes. But the later kings, particularly those of Etruscan origin, grew increasingly tyrannical, and the final king, a man remembered as Tarquin the Proud, ruled with such cruelty and arrogance that the Roman people finally rose against him. The spark that lit this rebellion, according to Roman tradition, was deeply personal. Tarquin's son was said to have committed a terrible crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia, and her tragic response to this violation so outraged the city that the people, led by a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus, drove the king and his family from Rome entirely. This happened, according to tradition, in the year 509 before Christ, and with the expulsion of the last king, Rome made a decision that would define its identity for the next several centuries. It would never again be ruled by a single king. Instead, it would become a republic. This was no small matter. In a world where kingship was the natural assumed form of government, where nearly every neighboring people and every great civilization from Egypt to Persia to Greece was ruled by monarchs, Rome chose a radically different path. Power would be shared, distributed among elected officials, checked and balanced against itself so that no single man could ever again hold absolute authority over the city. 2 consuls would be elected each year to serve as the highest officials, holding power jointly so that neither could act as a tyrant, each one able to veto the decisions of the other. A senate composed of the city's most respected elder statesmen would advise on matters of law, war, and finance. And though the system was far from what we would today call a democracy, since real power remained concentrated among wealthy aristocratic families known as patricians, it planted a seed of political thinking that would eventually influence nearly every republic and democracy that came after it, all the way to our modern world. The earliest years of the Roman Republic were not peaceful ones. The young city found itself surrounded by enemies on nearly every side. The Etruscans, humiliated by the loss of their influence over Rome, launched wars of revenge. The Sabines, the Volscians, and other Italian tribes tested Rome's borders again and again. Rome's early history is filled with tales of these constant struggles, stories that Roman children would grow up hearing for centuries afterward, tales meant to teach lessons of courage, discipline, and sacrifice for the good of the state. One such story tells of a Roman farmer named Cincinnatus, who was plowing his fields when messengers arrived to inform him that the Senate had appointed him dictator, a temporary but absolute position of power granted only in times of extreme crisis, needed because a nearby tribe had trapped a Roman army in a dangerous position. Cincinnatus left his plows standing in the field, took command of Rome's forces, defeated the enemy in a matter of days, and then, remarkably, resigned his absolute power and returned to his farm, refusing to cling to authority a single day longer than necessary. This story, whether entirely true or embellished over time, became a cherished symbol of Roman virtue, the idea that true greatness lay not in seeking power but in serving one's community and then stepping aside. Rome's early society was also marked by a long and difficult internal struggle, one that would shape its laws and institutions for generations. This was the conflict between the patricians, the wealthy noble families who held most of the political power, and the plebeians, the common people, who made up the vast majority of Rome's population, but had little say in how their city was governed. The plebeians worked the land, served in the army, paid taxes, yet found themselves shut out of political office, unable to marry into patrician families and often crushed by debt to wealthy patrician lenders. Over time, the plebeians began to organize, and in one famous episode, they simply walked away from Rome entirely, withdrawing to a nearby hill and refusing to return unless their grievances were addressed. This tactic, known as a secession, worked. The patricians, realizing that a city without its common workers and soldiers could not function, agreed to create a new office, the tribune of the plebs, elected representatives whose sacred duty was to protect the interests and even the physical safety of ordinary citizens. Over the following 2 centuries, the plebeians would continue to press for greater rights, eventually winning the ability to hold high office, to have their laws formally written down and displayed publicly so that no patrician judge could interpret them unfairly, and eventually achieving something close to full political equality with the patrician class. This gradual, often turbulent process of expanding rights, while never resulting in anything we would call true equality by modern standards, women remained excluded from political life entirely, and slavery remained a deeply embedded part of Roman society throughout its history. Nonetheless, demonstrated something remarkable about Rome. It was a society capable of resolving its deepest internal conflicts not always through violence, but through negotiation, compromise, and the gradual reform of its own laws. This flexibility, this willingness to adapt its institutions under pressure, would prove to be one of Rome's greatest strengths as it began to look beyond its own borders toward the rest of the Italian peninsula, and eventually toward the wider world. By the 4th century before Christ, Rome had survived Etruscan kings, foreign invasions, and its own internal class struggles, and it emerged from these trials as a hardened, disciplined, and increasingly ambitious city-state. It had developed a citizen army built on a foundation of civic duty, where every able-bodied male citizen was expected to serve when called upon. It had developed a political culture that, whatever its flaws, valued law, precedent, and the collective good of the state over the whims of any single ruler. And it had developed something perhaps even more important than armies or laws, a deep, almost unshakable belief in its own destiny, a conviction that Rome was meant for greatness. It was this conviction that would soon drive Rome into a series of wars with its neighbors on the Italian peninsula, wars that would test everything the young republic had built and which would set the stage for Rome's transformation from a modest city beside the Tiber into the master of an entire peninsula, and eventually into a power capable of challenging the greatest empires of the ancient world. In the chapter that follows, we will see how Rome, through a combination of military discipline, political shrewdness, and sheer determination, expanded its control across Italy, and how it survived one of the most dangerous threats it would ever face, an invasion by a Carthaginian general who would bring war elephants across the Alps and come closer than anyone in history to bringing Rome to its knees. Before we move forward in time, it is worth pausing to imagine what daily life actually looked like in this early Rome, in the centuries before marble temples and grand basilicas rose along the Forum. The city was still a rough and modest place. Most homes were simple structures of mud, brick, and timber, roofed with thatch, clustered along narrow, unpaved streets that turned to mud with every rainfall. Families lived close to the land, keeping small gardens, a few animals, and relying on the wheat, barley, and beans that grew in the fields beyond the city walls. religion touched every part of daily existence. The Romans believed that spirits, which they called noumena, inhabited the world around them, present in the hearth of the home, in the boundary stones between properties, in the rivers, the crossroads, and the fields. Before undertaking any task of importance, a Roman family might make a small offering, a bit of grain, a splash of wine, a whispered prayer to ensure the favor of these unseen forces. The father of the household, the paterfamilias, held enormous authority not only over his wife and children, but legally over every member of his household, including adult sons, for as long as he lived. Roman society placed extraordinary emphasis on virtues such as duty, discipline, and loyalty to the state, values the Romans summed up in a word that is difficult to translate fully into English: pietas. A sense of dutiful respect toward one's family, one's ancestors, and one's gods. A Roman who acted for his own selfish gain rather than for the good of his family or his city was viewed with deep suspicion, while a citizen who sacrificed personal comfort for the community, as Cincinnatus had done, was held up as the very model of what a Roman ought to be. The Roman army, too, was beginning to take the shape that would eventually make it one of the most effective fighting forces the ancient world had ever seen. In these early centuries, the army was not yet the professional salaried force it would later become. Instead, it was a citizen militia, made up of farmers and craftsmen who left their fields and workshops when called to arms, supplied their own weapons and armor according to their personal wealth, and returned home again once a campaign had ended. Wealthier citizens who could afford bronze armor, shields, and swords formed the heavily armored infantry at the center of the battle line, while poorer citizens served as lightly equipped skirmishers on the flanks. This system meant that nearly every free adult male in Rome had some direct stake in the safety and success of the city, for it was they and their sons and their neighbors who would be called upon to defend it. This shared burden, this sense that the city belonged not to a distant king but to its own citizens, would remain one of the defining features of Roman identity for centuries to come, long after the citizen militia gave way to professional legions, and long after the Republic itself gave way to something else entirely. And so, in these early years, Rome grew slowly, hill by hill, treaty by treaty, war by war, absorbing its neighbors, adopting their customs, borrowing their gods, and forging out of this patchwork of peoples a single unified identity that would come to call itself Roman. For now, let the story of the wolf, the twins, and the small city of huts beside the river settle quietly into memory, a beginning as humble as any in history, and yet the seed from which an empire would one day grow. With the kings gone and the republic newly formed, Rome stood as little more than one ambitious city among many on the Italian peninsula. To its north lay the Etruscan cities, proud and wealthy, resentful of the influence they had lost. To its east and south lived the Sabines, the Aequi, the Volscians, and dozens of smaller hill tribes, each guarding its own territory, each wary of its neighbors. Rome was strong for its size, disciplined and increasingly confident, but it was far from the master of Italy. That mastery would take centuries of slow, grinding effort to achieve, filled with setbacks, disasters, and one catastrophe so severe that it very nearly ended the Roman story before it had properly begun. In these early decades of the Republic, Roman life continued to be shaped by the long struggle between patricians and plebeians that we spoke of before, a struggle that unfolded gradually across generations even as Rome fought its neighbors on the battlefield. It is worth remembering that ancient wars were rarely fought by professional standing armies in the way we might imagine today. Roman soldiers were farmers first, warriors second, called away from their fields each campaigning season, expected to fight through the summer months, and released again in time for the harvest. This rhythm of farming and fighting shaped the pace of Roman expansion, slow, seasonal, and remarkably persistent. One of the darkest chapters in this early period came not from a rival Italian tribe, but from a people who arrived from far to the north, a Celtic people the Romans called the Gauls. Around the year 390 before Christ, a large force of Gallic warriors swept down through northern Italy, defeated a hastily assembled Roman army at a river called the Allia, and marched virtually unopposed straight into the city of Rome itself. What followed was, in the memory of every Roman who came after, one of the most humiliating moments in the city's history. The Gauls occupied and burned much of the city, while the surviving Roman defenders retreated to a final stronghold atop the Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of Roman religious life. According to Roman legend, the defenders on the Capitoline very nearly fell to a surprise night attack, saved only by the honking of sacred geese kept in the temple of Juno, whose noise woke the sleeping garrison in time to repel the climbing Gauls. Eventually, according to tradition, the Romans were forced to pay a heavy ransom in gold to persuade the Gauls to leave. As the gold was being weighed, a Roman is said to have complained that the scales the Gauls were using were dishonestly weighted against them, to which the Gallic chieftain Brennus supposedly threw his own sword onto the scale as well, uttering the famous words, "Woe to the vanquished," meaning that the defeated have no right to complain of unfair treatment. Whatever the precise details, the sack of Rome by the Gauls left a permanent scar on the Roman psyche. For generations afterward, the Romans harbored a deep, almost instinctive fear of the peoples they called Gauls, a fear that would resurface centuries later in their wars against Celtic tribes across the Alps. And that would echo even in the fear felt when Hannibal himself later crossed those same mountains with an army that included warriors from Gallic tribes eager for revenge against Rome. But rather than being destroyed by this disaster, Rome did what it would so often do throughout its long history. It rebuilt, it reformed, and it emerged stronger than before. New, more massive stone walls were constructed around the city, later remembered as the Servian Walls, though built somewhat later than the king whose name they carried. Roman military organization was reformed as well, moving away from the older style of fighting in a single dense mass, borrowed originally from Greek hoplite warfare, toward a new, more flexible system organized around smaller units called maniples, each capable of moving somewhat independently across rough terrain, adapting to the hilly, broken landscape of the Italian countryside far better than a rigid Greek-style phalanx ever could. This reformed Roman army, patient, disciplined, and increasingly adaptable, began a long series of wars against its Italian neighbors that would, over the following century, bring the entire peninsula under Roman control. Among the most difficult of these conflicts were the wars fought against a hardy mountain people called the Samnites, who inhabited the rugged central Apennines. The Samnite Wars, fought across 3 separate conflicts spanning decades, tested Roman military capability to its limits. At one particularly humiliating moment, an entire Roman army was trapped in a narrow mountain pass called the Caudine Forks, surrounded on all sides by Samnite forces occupying the high ground. Rather than face annihilation, the Roman commanders were forced to surrender, and the defeated legions were made to pass beneath a yoke of spears, a ritual of total humiliation that Roman soldiers of the time considered a fate almost worse than death. Yet even this disaster did not break Rome's determination. Over the following decades, Roman forces gradually wore down Samnite resistance, absorbing not only the Samnites themselves, but also allying with, conquering, or absorbing dozens of other Italian peoples in the process: the Etruscans in the north, the various Latin tribes closest to Rome, and Greek colonial cities scattered along the southern coast of Italy. It was in dealing with these conquered peoples that Rome revealed one of the true secrets of its future success: a genius not merely for war, but for the management of conquered populations. rather than simply crushing defeated enemies or extracting tribute from them as a distant subject people, as many ancient empires had done before. Rome instead offered many of its defeated foes a form of partnership. Some communities were granted full Roman citizenship, becoming Romans in every legal sense. Others received a partial form of citizenship, carrying certain rights and obligations without full political participation. Still others became formal allies of Rome, retaining their own local governments and customs but obligated to supply soldiers for Roman military campaigns. This policy, which historians often describe using the Latin phrase divide and rule, though perhaps more accurately understood as integrate and absorb, meant that as Rome expanded, its enemies of yesterday often became the soldiers of tomorrow, fighting alongside Roman legions in exchange for a share, however partial, in the growing benefits of Roman power. This system of alliance and gradual integration created a manpower reserve unlike anything possessed by Rome's rivals. A vast pool of Italian soldiers who, whatever their grievances, generally found it more advantageous to remain loyal to Rome than to rebel against it. By the early 3rd century before Christ, Rome had extended its control across the vast majority of the Italian peninsula, an achievement that had taken well over a century of nearly continuous warfare to accomplish. Only the Greek cities of southern Italy, wealthy, cultured, and proudly independent, remained largely outside direct Roman control, though increasingly nervous about the ambitious power growing to their north. It was one of these Greek cities, Tarentum, that would draw Rome into its first major conflict beyond the borders of Italy itself, and its first true test against a professional Hellenistic-style army led by one of the most skilled generals of the ancient world. When a dispute erupted between Tarentum and Rome, the Greek city appealed for help to King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a distant relative of Alexander the Great, and a general renowned throughout the Mediterranean for his tactical brilliance. Pyrrhus arrived in Italy with a formidable force that included something Roman soldiers had never before faced on the battlefield: war elephants, massive beasts that terrified the Roman infantry and their horses alike. In the battles that followed, Pyrrhus won repeated victories against Roman forces, yet each victory cost him so many of his finest soldiers that he is famously said to have remarked that one more such victory would utterly ruin him, a phrase that has echoed down through history in the term Pyrrhic victory, meaning any triumph so costly that it amounts in practical terms to defeat. Eventually, worn down by these costly engagements and by Rome's seemingly endless capacity to raise fresh armies from its network of Italian allies, Pyrrhus abandoned his campaign in Italy and returned to Greece, leaving Tarentum and the remaining independent Greek cities of southern Italy with no choice but to submit to Roman authority. By 272 before Christ, the war with Pyrrhus concluded, and with it, Roman control over the Italian peninsula was essentially complete. In little more than 2 centuries since the overthrow of its last king, Rome had transformed itself from a single struggling city-state into the unquestioned master of an entire peninsula, a peninsula rich in manpower, agriculture, and strategic ports along both the eastern and western Mediterranean coastlines. Yet even as the Romans celebrated this achievement, a far greater and more dangerous power was watching Roman expansion with growing concern from across the sea. This was Carthage, a wealthy trading city on the coast of North Africa, whose merchant fleets dominated trade across the western Mediterranean, and whose growing unease at Roman ambition would soon draw both civilizations into one of the longest, bloodiest, and most consequential conflicts in the history of the ancient world. Before we turn to that story, it is worth pausing once more to consider how deeply this long process of Italian conquest shaped Roman society itself, not only on the battlefield but within the city walls. As Roman territory expanded, so too did the wealth flowing into Rome, wealth in the form of captured land, agricultural produce, and the spoils of war. This new wealth did not spread evenly among the Roman population. Wealthy aristocratic families already dominant within the Senate found themselves in an ideal position to acquire the largest and most fertile tracts of newly conquered land, often working these estates with captured prisoners of war who were increasingly pressed into slavery on a scale far beyond what earlier smaller-scale Roman society had known. Ordinary Roman farmers, by contrast, often found themselves at a growing disadvantage. Many had spent years away from their own modest farms while serving in the army, only to return home to find their fields overgrown, their debts mounting, and their small holdings increasingly unable to compete with the vast slave-worked estates of the wealthy. This growing inequality between rich and poor, though it would not fully erupt into crisis for another century, was quietly planting seeds of tension that would eventually contribute to some of the most turbulent chapters in Roman history. Chapters we will explore later in this story. At the same time, Roman religious and civic life continued to grow more elaborate as the city's wealth and influence increased. Temples that had once been simple wooden shrines were rebuilt in stone, adorned with sculptures and offerings brought back from conquered territories. Public festivals grew larger and more frequent, occasions on which the entire city would gather to honor the gods, celebrate military victories, and reinforce the shared sense of Roman identity that bound together patrician and plebeian, native-born Roman, and newly incorporated Italian ally alike. It was also during this period that Rome began to develop many of the legal and administrative practices that would later allow it to govern territories far beyond Italy itself. Roman law, first written down in a public code known as the 12 Tables during the early years of the plebeian struggle for rights, continued to grow more sophisticated, establishing principles of property, contract, and civic obligation that would eventually influence legal systems across the entire Mediterranean world, and indeed, across much of the modern world that followed many centuries later. Roman roads, too, began to spread outward from the city during this era. Engineering marvels built primarily for military purposes, allowing legions to move quickly between different parts of Roman-controlled territory, but which also, almost as a side effect, began to knit together the scattered communities of Italy into a single, interconnected network of trade and communication. The most famous of these early roads, the Appian Way, stretched southward from Rome toward the territories won during the wars against the Samnites and later against Pyrrhus. A stone-paved highway sturdy enough that portions of it remain visible even today, more than 2,000 years after its construction. By the time the war with Pyrrhus concluded, Rome had become something genuinely new in the ancient Mediterranean world. Not simply another city-state among many, but a vast, interconnected confederation of peoples, bound together by treaties, shared military service, expanding law, and increasingly by roads of stone that physically linked one community to the next. This was the foundation, quiet, patient, and built over nearly 2.5 centuries, upon which Rome would soon attempt something far more ambitious than the conquest of a single peninsula. It is easy, looking back across so many centuries, to imagine this rise as inevitable, as though Rome's later greatness was somehow written into its fate from the very beginning. But nothing about this long, difficult climb was ever certain. Rome lost battles. Rome lost entire armies. Rome watched its own city burned to the ground by Gallic invaders, and watched its soldiers march beneath a Samnite yoke in disgrace. What set Rome apart from so many of its rivals was not the absence of failure, but its refusal to treat failure as final. Each defeat became, in Roman hands, simply another problem to be studied, another weakness to be reformed, another reason to rebuild stronger walls, train better soldiers, and forge sturdier alliances with its neighbors. It was this quiet, stubborn persistence repeated across generations that would soon be tested more severely than ever before against an enemy from across the sea whose skill in the arts of war would push Roman resilience to its absolute limit. In the story that follows, we will meet a general whose name would become forever linked with audacity and near disaster for Rome. A man who led war elephants across the frozen peaks of the Alps and brought Roman power closer to total collapse than it had ever come before, or would ever come again for centuries afterward. For now, let the memory of this long, patient rise settle quietly into the mind. A young republic tested by fire, by humiliation, by mountain ambushes and foreign elephants, and yet emerging each time a little stronger, a little wiser, and a little closer to the destiny it believed awaited it. Across the narrow strip of sea separating Italy from North Africa stood a city that, in the middle of the 3rd century before Christ, was in many ways wealthier and more powerful than Rome itself. This was Carthage, founded centuries earlier by seafaring traders from Phoenicia, a city that had grown into the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean. Carthaginian merchant ships carried goods between Spain, North Africa, Sicily, and the coasts of Italy, and Carthaginian wealth, built on trade rather than conquest of land, had made the city one of the true superpowers of the ancient world. For a long time, Rome and Carthage had coexisted without serious conflict, each occupied with its own sphere of influence, Rome expanding across the Italian mainland while Carthage focused on trade routes and coastal territories around the Western Mediterranean. But as Rome completed its conquest of Italy, its attention naturally turned towards Sicily. The large island lying just off the toe of the Italian boot, an island that was of enormous strategic and economic importance, and one in which Carthage already held significant territory and influence. It was a relatively minor local conflict on Sicily involving a group of mercenaries in the city of Messina that drew both great powers into direct confrontation, beginning what history remembers as the First Punic War. Taking its name from Poeni, the Latin word for the Phoenician-descended people of Carthage. This first war, fought largely at sea, a domain in which Rome had almost no prior experience whatsoever, revealed something remarkable about Roman character. Faced with a Carthaginian navy far superior to anything Rome possessed, the Romans simply built a navy of their own, reportedly using a captured Carthaginian warship as a model to copy, and equipping their new vessels with a clever boarding device called the corvus, a spiked gangplank that allowed Roman soldiers to transform naval battles into something closer to the land combat in which their legions already excelled. The First Punic War dragged on for more than 2 decades, a grinding, exhausting conflict that cost both sides enormous numbers of ships, sailors, and soldiers. Rome suffered catastrophic naval losses on several occasions, entire fleets destroyed not only by Carthaginian forces but by violent Mediterranean storms that Roman sailors, still relatively inexperienced at sea, struggled to survive. Yet each time disaster struck, Rome rebuilt its fleet and continued the fight, drawing on the deep reserves of manpower and resources it had accumulated through its long conquest of Italy. Eventually, in 241 before Christ, a decisive Roman naval victory forced Carthage to sue for peace, ceding Sicily to Roman control and paying a heavy war indemnity. This first war left deep and bitter resentment in Carthage, resentment that was carried forward with particular intensity by one prominent Carthaginian family, the Barcids. According to a story told by ancient historians, the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca brought his young son before an altar and made the boy swear a sacred oath, a vow of eternal hatred toward Rome. That young boy's name was Hannibal, and he would grow up to become perhaps the single most feared enemy Rome ever faced in its long history. A military genius whose campaigns are still studied by soldiers and historians today. In the years following the First War, Carthage rebuilt its power and wealth largely through the conquest of new territory in Spain, a campaign led first by Hamilcar and after his death by his son-in-law, and eventually by Hannibal himself, who took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain while still a young man, remembered by his soldiers as someone who shared every hardship of the march and battle alongside his troops, sleeping on the ground among them rather than retreating to comfortable quarters. Tensions between Rome and this resurgent Carthaginian power in Spain eventually erupted into open war once again when Hannibal besieged and captured a Spanish city allied with Rome. Rome demanded that Carthage hand Hannibal over for punishment, a demand Carthage refused, and by 218 before Christ, the Second Punic War had begun, a conflict that would bring Rome closer to complete destruction than at any other point in its history. Rather than waiting for Rome to attack Carthaginian territory or attempting a naval invasion of Italy where Roman power was strongest, Hannibal made a decision so audacious that it stunned both his enemies and, in some ways, his own allies. He would march his army, including a contingent of war elephants, overland from Spain through southern Gaul and across the towering snow-covered peaks of the Alps themselves, descending directly into Italy from the north, a direction from which Rome had never expected a major invasion to come. The crossing of the Alps remains one of the most legendary military achievements in all of ancient history. Hannibal's army faced brutal cold, narrow mountain paths clinging to sheer cliff faces, hostile mountain tribes who harassed the column with ambushes and rock slides, and the constant danger of losing footing on ice-covered trails, sending men, horses, and elephants alike tumbling into the deep ravines below. Ancient sources describe soldiers freezing to death in their sleep, pack animals slipping to their deaths on treacherous ice, and the sheer psychological terror of an army raised largely in the warm climates of Spain and North Africa, suddenly confronting a landscape of snow and ice unlike anything most of these soldiers had ever seen. By the time Hannibal's forces finally descended into the plains of northern Italy, his army had shrunk dramatically from the force with which he had begun the crossing. Yet what remained was a hardened, battle-tested corps of soldiers utterly devoted to their commander. What followed was a string of catastrophic defeats for Rome, each more shocking than the last. At the Tiber River, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a trap, using hidden troops concealed along the riverbank to attack the Romans from behind after they had already crossed the freezing water, exhausted and unprepared for combat. At Lake Trasimene, Hannibal executed perhaps the most successful ambush in the history of ancient warfare, concealing his entire army along a narrow lakeside road shrouded in morning mist, allowing a Roman army to march completely into the trap before attacking from higher ground on three sides at once, trapping the Romans between the mountains and the lake itself. Thousands of Roman soldiers, unable to form a battle line in the chaos and confusion, were slaughtered or driven into the lake to drown. Yet even these disasters paled in comparison to what awaited Rome at a small town in southern Italy called Cannae in 216 before Christ. There, Rome assembled what was, up to that point, the largest army it had ever fielded, reportedly numbering somewhere between 70 and 80,000 soldiers, determined to crush Hannibal's smaller force once and for all through sheer weight of numbers. Instead, Hannibal executed a tactical maneuver so brilliant that it remains studied in military academies to this very day. He arranged his center line to be deliberately weak, allowing it to bow backward under the pressure of the Roman advance, drawing the Roman infantry deeper and deeper into what appeared to be a collapsing Carthaginian formation, while his stronger cavalry and infantry units on the flanks curved around, encircling the Roman army entirely. The result was one of the single bloodiest days in the history of ancient warfare. Trapped and surrounded, unable to maneuver in the crushing press of their own numbers, the Roman army was systematically destroyed. Ancient historians estimate that as many as 50,000 Roman soldiers may have died in a single day of fighting, a scale of loss that modern historians consider comparable to the worst single-day death tolls of far later wars fought many centuries afterward, including some of the deadliest battles of the modern era. Rome had lost in this single catastrophic afternoon a significant percentage of its entire adult male citizen population. In the aftermath of Cannae, it seemed to many observers throughout the Mediterranean world that Rome's destruction was simply a matter of time. Several of Rome's Italian allies, believing Roman power to be finished, defected to join Hannibal's cause. Panic gripped the city of Rome itself, where, according to ancient accounts, the Senate even considered, and according to some sources briefly resorted to, the ancient and deeply feared practice of human sacrifice. Burying pairs of Gauls and Greeks alive in the city's cattle market, in a desperate attempt to appease what many Romans believed must be the anger of the gods. Yet remarkably, Rome refused to surrender. Instead of seeking peace, the Senate declared that any Roman citizen who spoke of negotiating with Hannibal would be considered a traitor to the state. New legions were raised, in some cases from citizens previously considered too old, too young, or too poor for military service, including, in this moment of extreme crisis, thousands of slaves who were purchased by the state and granted freedom in exchange for military service. Rather than risking another disastrous set-piece battle against Hannibal's tactical brilliance, Roman commanders adopted a new strategy of deliberate delay and attrition, refusing to meet Hannibal in open battle, instead harassing his supply lines, protecting Roman-held cities from siege, and slowly, patiently wearing down Hannibal's ability to sustain his campaign deep within hostile Italian territory. Far from reinforcement or resupply from Carthage itself, for more than a decade, Hannibal remained in Italy, winning battle after battle whenever Roman forces were foolish enough to confront him directly, yet finding himself increasingly unable to translate these tactical victories into any lasting strategic advantage. Rome, meanwhile, took the war to other fronts entirely, sending armies to campaign against Carthaginian territories in Spain and Sicily, gradually stripping away the resources and reinforcements that might otherwise have flowed to support Hannibal's campaign in Italy. It was in Spain that a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had lost both his father and his uncle in earlier fighting against Carthaginian forces there, began to distinguish himself as a military talent to rival even Hannibal himself. Scipio's campaigns in Spain proved so successful that Carthaginian power there was almost entirely broken, and Scipio returned to Rome as something of a hero, eventually convincing the Senate, despite considerable political resistance from more cautious rivals, to allow him to carry the war directly to Carthaginian territory in North Africa itself. Scipio's invasion of Africa achieved precisely what its architect had hoped. Faced with a Roman army now threatening the city of Carthage itself, the Carthaginian government recalled Hannibal from Italy, ending his 16-year campaign on Italian soil, without ever having achieved the final decisive victory over Rome that had always eluded him. The two greatest generals of the ancient Mediterranean world finally met face to face on the battlefield near the town of Zama, in North Africa, in 202 before Christ. In this climactic confrontation, Scipio, who had carefully studied Hannibal's own tactics and prepared specific countermeasures against the Carthaginian war elephants, achieved a decisive victory, effectively ending Hannibal's military career and forcing Carthage to accept a humiliating peace, surrendering its overseas territories, its war fleet, and its ability to wage war without Roman permission ever again. The Second Punic War left Rome not merely victorious, but utterly transformed. It had survived the single greatest military threat in its history, a threat that had cost it, by some ancient estimates, several 100,000 lives across the long years of the conflict. an almost unimaginable toll for a society of that era's size. Yet Rome emerged from this ordeal not weakened, but strengthened, having proven in the crucible of near-total disaster a resilience and depth of resource that no other power in the Mediterranean world could match. There remained more than 50 years later one final chapter to this long and bitter rivalry. Despite its crushing defeat, Carthage had slowly rebuilt its wealth through trade, and this recovery alarmed certain influential voices within the Roman Senate, most famously a senator named Cato the Elder, who is said to have ended every single speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of its actual subject, with the same ominous phrase that Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 before Christ, Rome finally acted on this long-simmering fear, launching the Third Punic War, a conflict that bore little resemblance to the desperate, evenly matched struggle of Hannibal's era. This time, Rome's overwhelming military superiority left Carthage with no real chance of survival. After a brutal, prolonged siege of the city itself, Roman forces breached Carthage's walls in 146 before Christ, and in the devastation that followed, the once great city was burned, its surviving population enslaved, and its territory absorbed directly into the growing Roman world. With the destruction of Carthage, Rome's last serious rival for dominance in the Western Mediterranean was gone entirely. What had begun more than a century earlier as a relatively minor territorial dispute over the island of Sicily had grown into a series of wars that reshaped the entire ancient world, eliminating one great civilization and confirming beyond any remaining doubt the emergence of Rome as the unquestioned master of the Mediterranean. In the chapters that follow, we will see how this newfound power began to transform Rome itself, drawing it into ever wider conflicts across the Mediterranean world, and setting the stage for a new kind of Roman figure entirely, ambitious individual generals and statesmen whose personal power would eventually grow so great that the old republican system, built so carefully over centuries to prevent the return of kings, would begin slowly and almost imperceptibly to crack under the weight of its own success. For now, let the memory of Hannibal's elephants crossing the frozen Alps and the desperate, stubborn resilience of a Rome that refused to accept defeat even after the horror of Cannae settle quietly into memory. A story of two great civilizations locked in a struggle that would determine for centuries to come the entire future shape of the ancient world. In the century following the destruction of Carthage, Rome found itself facing a very different kind of danger than any it had encountered before. A danger that came not from a foreign general crossing the Alps, but from deep cracks forming within Roman society itself. The old republic, built so carefully over centuries to prevent any single man from holding too much power, began to strain under pressures that its founders could never have fully anticipated. The pressures of vast new wealth, enormous new territories, and a growing gap between the ordinary citizens of Rome and the increasingly powerful aristocratic families who dominated the Senate. We touched earlier on the quiet inequality that had begun to grow during Rome's long conquest of Italy, as wealthy families acquired ever larger estates worked by slave labor, while ordinary Roman farmers, many of whom had spent years away from their land fighting in Rome's wars, found themselves squeezed out, unable to compete with these vast slave-worked plantations. By the latter part of the 2nd century before Christ, this quiet inequality had grown into a crisis impossible to ignore. Landless citizens crowded into the city of Rome itself, forming a large and increasingly restless urban population with little stake in the old aristocratic order. It was against this backdrop that two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, attempted sweeping reforms intended to redistribute public land to landless citizens and address the growing crisis of inequality. Both brothers, remembered by history as the Gracchi, met violent ends at the hands of political opponents within the Senate, who viewed their reforms as a dangerous threat to the established aristocratic order. Their deaths marked a grim turning point in Roman political life, the first time in centuries that Roman politicians had resorted to outright political murder to resolve their disputes, a precedent that would haunt Roman politics for the remainder of the Republic's existence. In the decades that followed, this growing pattern of political violence intensified further, fueled by a series of ambitious military commanders who discovered that loyal legions, personally devoted to a successful general rather than to the abstract institutions of the state, could become powerful tools in domestic political struggles. Two such commanders, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, engaged in a bitter rivalry that eventually escalated into outright civil war. With Sulla, in an unprecedented and deeply shocking act, actually marching his own Roman legions into the city of Rome itself to seize power by force, something no Roman general had ever dared to do before. Sulla eventually had himself declared dictator, ordered brutal purges of his political enemies, their names posted on public lists that offered rewards to anyone who killed them, and then, remarkably, voluntarily resigned his dictatorial powers and retired from public life. An act reminiscent of the ancient legend of Cincinnatus, though achieved through considerably bloodier means. It was into this atmosphere of political violence, ambitious generals, and a republic increasingly strained by its own internal contradictions that a young aristocrat named Gaius Julius Caesar was born in the year 100 before Christ into a patrician family that, despite its ancient lineage, had fallen on relatively modest financial circumstances by the standards of Rome's wealthiest elite. Caesar's early career followed a fairly conventional path for an ambitious young Roman politician, serving in various military and administrative posts, accumulating enormous personal debts in the process, debts he used strategically to fund lavish public games and displays that won him popularity among the ordinary citizens of Rome, even as they left him dangerously exposed to his creditors and political rivals alike. Caesar's true rise to prominence began when he formed an informal political alliance with two of the most powerful men in Rome, the fabulously wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Rome's most celebrated military commander of the era, Pompey the Great. This arrangement, remembered by historians as the First Triumvirate, though never a formal or legally recognized institution, allowed the three men to dominate Roman politics through their combined wealth, military prestige, and political influence, effectively sidelining the traditional authority of the Senate for a time. With the backing of this powerful alliance, Caesar secured for himself command of Roman military forces in Gaul, the territory roughly corresponding to modern France and parts of surrounding regions, and it was here, over the following decade, that Caesar transformed himself from a talented but relatively unproven politician into one of the greatest military commanders in Roman history. The Gallic Wars, which Caesar himself would later describe in a famous written account, saw Roman legions under his command conquer the various Gallic tribes of the region through a combination of military skill, calculated brutality, and shrewd diplomatic manipulation of rivalries between different Gallic peoples. One episode from these wars stands out with particular drama: the Great Siege of Alesia, where Caesar's legions found themselves besieging a large Gallic army under the command of a charismatic chieftain named Vercingetorix, who had united many previously divided Gallic tribes into a serious resistance movement against Roman conquest. In an extraordinary feat of military engineering, Caesar's forces constructed not one but two massive rings of fortification around the besieged city. An inner ring to contain Vercingetorix's forces trapped within Alesia, and an outer ring to defend against a massive Gallic relief army attempting to break the siege from outside. Trapped between these two Roman fortified lines and facing starvation, Vercingetorix eventually surrendered, effectively ending organized Gallic resistance to Roman conquest and adding an enormous new territory to Rome's growing domains. while Caesar's star rose ever higher through his conquest of Gaul. The delicate political alliance that had enabled his rise began to fracture. Crassus, driven by his own desire to match the military glory of his two partners, led a Roman army into a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, a campaign that ended in catastrophic defeat and Crassus's own death at a battle near Carrhae. With Crassus gone, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey, always somewhat uneasy, deteriorated further, aggravated by the death of Pompey's wife, who had been Caesar's own daughter and who had served as a personal bond helping to hold the two ambitious men together despite their rivalry. As Caesar's term of command in Gaul approached its end, a critical political question arose in Rome: whether Caesar would be required to give up his military command and return to the city as a private citizen, a status that would leave him vulnerable to prosecution by political enemies eager to punish him for various controversial actions taken during his years in Gaul, or whether he would be permitted some special arrangement allowing him to transition directly into a new position of political authority without ever surrendering his legions. The Senate, increasingly dominated by Caesar's political enemies and now allied with Pompey himself, ultimately demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, stripped of military protection. Caesar, unwilling to accept a return to Rome that he believed would result in his political destruction, made one of the most consequential decisions in all of Roman history. In January of 49 before Christ, he led a single legion across a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon, the traditional boundary beyond which Roman law forbade any general from bringing armed troops into Italy itself. This act constituted an unambiguous declaration of civil war against the Roman state. According to ancient historians, Caesar hesitated at the river's edge before finally crossing, reportedly uttering the phrase, "The die is cast," acknowledging that this single action would irrevocably commit him to a path from which there could be no safe return. The civil war that followed pitted Caesar's battle-hardened legions from Gaul against the forces loyal to Pompey and the Senate, a conflict that spread across the entire Mediterranean world, from Italy and Spain to Greece, Egypt, and North Africa. Pompey, initially caught unprepared by the speed of Caesar's advance into Italy, withdrew across the Adriatic Sea to gather larger forces in Greece, buying time to assemble an army that, on paper, significantly outnumbered Caesar's own veteran but comparatively smaller force. The decisive confrontation between these two great Roman commanders came at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in 48 before Christ, where Caesar, despite being significantly outnumbered, used superior tactics and the exceptional discipline of his veteran legions to inflict a crushing defeat on Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Pompey himself fled the battlefield and eventually sought refuge in Egypt, hoping that his previous alliance with the ruling Egyptian dynasty might offer him protection and support to continue the struggle against Caesar. Instead, in a shocking betrayal, Egyptian officials, hoping to curry favor with the clearly ascendant Caesar, had Pompey murdered as he stepped ashore, presenting his severed head to Caesar as a gift when the victorious general arrived in Egypt shortly afterward. Rather than celebrating this news, Caesar is said to have wept upon seeing the death of a man who had once been his ally, and even his son-in-law, and he ordered the execution of those responsible for what he viewed as a dishonorable murder rather than a legitimate act of war. While in Egypt, Caesar became entangled in a local succession dispute, ultimately supporting the young Egyptian queen Cleopatra in her struggle against her brother and co-ruler, an alliance that developed into a famous personal relationship between the two, and which helped secure Cleopatra's hold on the Egyptian throne under Roman protection. Over the following several years, Caesar systematically defeated the remaining forces still loyal to the cause of the Senate and Pompey's surviving supporters, campaigning across North Africa and Spain until all significant military resistance had been crushed. By 45 before Christ, Caesar stood as the unchallenged master of the entire Roman world, a position of personal power and authority unlike anything any single individual had held in the more than 4 centuries since Rome had overthrown its last king. Caesar used this newfound authority to implement a wide range of reforms, some of lasting historical significance, including a thorough reform of the Roman calendar that, with only minor later adjustments, remains essentially the calendar used throughout much of the world even today. He extended Roman citizenship to various provincial populations, initiated ambitious public building projects, and took steps to address the long-simmering economic grievances of Rome's poorer citizens. Yet alongside these genuine reforms, Caesar also accumulated an accumulation of honors and powers that increasingly alarmed many within the traditional Roman aristocracy, including his appointment as dictator for life, a title that, regardless of Caesar's own personal intentions, carried unmistakable echoes of the kingship that Rome had rejected so many centuries before. This growing concern that Caesar intended to make himself a king in all but name, combined with personal jealousies, political grievances, and a genuine ideological commitment among certain senators to the old republican traditions of shared power, led a group of conspirators, including men who had once been close personal friends and allies of Caesar himself, most notably Marcus Junius Brutus, to plot his assassination. On the 15th of March, a date remembered ever since by its ancient Roman designation, the Ides of March, in 44 before Christ, this group of senators surrounded Caesar during a Senate meeting and stabbed him to death, reportedly inflicting some 23 wounds upon him. According to later legend, though its historical accuracy is uncertain, Caesar's final words upon recognizing Brutus among his attackers were an anguished expression of betrayal at seeing a man he had trusted and favored join in his murder. The conspirators who killed Caesar believed with sincere conviction that his death would restore the old republic, freeing Rome from the danger of one-man rule and returning power to the Senate as it had existed before Caesar's rise. Instead, Caesar's assassination triggered a fresh round of civil wars even more destructive than the conflict between Caesar and Pompey had been. Wars that would ultimately determine once and for all whether the old Roman Republic could survive in any meaningful form, or whether the age of the Roman emperors was about to begin. In the chapter that follows, we will see how Caesar's own adopted heir, a remarkably patient and calculating young man barely out of his teenage years at the time of his adoptive father's murder, outmaneuvered every rival for power, brought an end to a century of civil war and political violence, and transformed himself gradually and carefully into the first emperor of Rome, ruling not as a king in name, but wielding an authority that would have made any ancient Roman king or Etruscan tyrant deeply envious. For now, let the memory of the crossing of the Rubicon and the fall of Caesar beneath the knives of men he once called friends settle quietly into memory, a turning point after which the old Roman world could never quite return to what it once had been. When Julius Caesar was murdered on the floor of the Senate, few among his assassins could have predicted that the true heir to his power would be an 18-year-old great-nephew, a physically frail young man who had spent most of his short life far from the battlefields and political intrigues that defined Roman public life. His name, at the time of Caesar's death, was Gaius Octavius, though history would eventually come to know him by a far grander title, Augustus the First, and in many ways the greatest of Rome's emperors. Octavius, as we will call him for now, learned of Caesar's assassination while studying abroad in Greece, and rather than fleeing the danger that clearly awaited anyone associated with Caesar's name, he made the bold decision to return immediately to Italy, claiming his inheritance as Caesar's adopted son and heir, a status confirmed in Caesar's own will. This inheritance included not only Caesar's considerable personal wealth, but something arguably far more valuable, his name itself, and the fierce loyalty that name still commanded among Caesar's veteran soldiers, and among the ordinary citizens of Rome who had adored their fallen leader. The young Octavius, whom we will now refer to by his adopted name Octavian, quickly proved himself to possess a political shrewdness that far exceeded what his youth and inexperience might have suggested. Rather than immediately confronting Mark Antony, Caesar's most prominent surviving lieutenant and the man who had initially positioned himself as Caesar's natural political successor, Octavian instead maneuvered carefully between various factions, at times allying with the Senate against Antony, and at other times recognizing that his own long-term interests required cooperation with Antony rather than opposition. Eventually, Octavian, Antony, and a third figure named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus formed a new political alliance known to history as the Second Triumvirate. Though unlike the informal arrangement between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus decades earlier, this new triumvirate was granted formal, legally recognized power by the Roman state itself, essentially dividing supreme authority over the Roman world between these three men. One of the first and darkest acts of this new alliance was a program of proscriptions, published lists of political enemies who could be legally killed and whose property could be confiscated by the state. A program that claimed the lives of thousands of Romans, including famously the great orator and statesman Cicero, whose eloquent criticism of Antony had made him a marked man. With their political enemies within Rome eliminated or silenced, the triumvirs turned their attention to Caesar's actual assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who had fled east and raised substantial armies of their own in the provinces of Greece and Asia Minor. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Philippi in 42 before Christ, where the combined forces of Antony and Octavian defeated the armies of Brutus and Cassius in two separate engagements, with both leading conspirators eventually taking their own lives rather than facing capture. A fate not uncommon among defeated Roman aristocrats who valued a dignified death over the humiliation of surrender. With the immediate threat from Caesar's assassins eliminated, the underlying tensions within the triumvirate itself began to resurface. Lepidus, always the weakest of the three partners, was gradually stripped of his power and effectively forced into early retirement, leaving Octavian and Antony to divide the Roman world between them, with Octavian generally controlling the western provinces, including Italy and Rome itself, while Antony took charge of the wealthy eastern provinces, a division that also brought Antony into close contact and eventually into a famous romantic and political partnership with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt who had once been Julius Caesar's own ally and lover. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra, and the political consequences that flowed from it, would ultimately provide the spark for the final civil war of this long, turbulent period. Octavian, a master of political propaganda, portrayed Antony's alliance with Cleopatra not as a legitimate political partnership between Rome and an allied kingdom, but as evidence that Antony had abandoned his Roman identity entirely, seduced by a foreign queen who, in Octavian's carefully crafted public narrative, sought nothing less than to conquer Rome itself and rule as an Eastern despot alongside her Roman consort. This propaganda campaign proved remarkably effective in turning Roman public opinion decisively against Antony, even though the historical reality of the political and military situation was almost certainly far more complicated than Octavian's simplified narrative suggested. The final showdown between these two former allies came at the naval battle of Actium, off the western coast of Greece in 31 before Christ. There, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant and loyal general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined naval forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Both Antony and Cleopatra escaped the battle itself, but their cause was effectively finished, and as Octavian's forces advanced on Egypt over the following year, both Antony and Cleopatra ultimately chose suicide rather than the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of Rome as captives in Octavian's eventual triumph. With their deaths and the formal annexation of Egypt as a Roman province, Octavian stood as the sole, unchallenged master of the entire Roman world. Yet Octavian, having witnessed firsthand how his adoptive father's accumulation of visible autocratic power had led directly to Caesar's assassination, was determined not to repeat that same fatal mistake. Rather than declaring himself king, or even openly claiming the title of dictator that Caesar had held, Octavian instead engineered an extraordinarily clever political settlement, one that preserved the outward appearance and traditional institutions of the old republic: the Senate, the annual elected offices, the ancient ceremonies and titles, while quietly concentrating real substantive power in his own hands through a careful combination of formal legal authorities, personal wealth, and above all, his unrivaled control over the loyalty of Rome's legions. In 27 before Christ, in a carefully staged political ceremony, Octavian publicly offered to relinquish his extraordinary powers and restore full authority to the Senate and the Roman people. The Senate, as Octavian surely anticipated, refused this offer, instead granting him a series of special honors and titles, including the name by which history would remember him ever after: Augustus, a title carrying connotations of reverence, majesty, and semi-divine authority without ever explicitly claiming the forbidden title of king. This system of government, in which Augustus ruled as what historians now call a princeps, meaning first citizen, while maintaining the careful fiction that the republic continued to function as before, became known as the Principate, and it would provide the basic constitutional framework for Roman government for the next 3 centuries. The nearly 4.5 decades during which Augustus ruled Rome, from his final victory at Actium until his death in the year 14 after Christ, transformed nearly every aspect of Roman life. After more than a century of nearly continuous civil war, political violence, and social upheaval, Augustus brought Rome an extended period of internal peace and stability that his contemporaries and countless generations of historians afterward would come to know as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period that would ultimately extend with only occasional interruptions for roughly 2 centuries following Augustus's own reign. Augustus used this hard-won stability to reshape Rome in truly remarkable ways. He famously claimed with justified pride that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, referring to his extensive program of public building projects, temples, theaters, public baths, and grand public spaces that transformed the physical appearance of the city itself. He reformed the Roman military into a smaller, more professional, permanently standing force, with fixed terms of service and guaranteed retirement benefits, reducing the dangerous reliance on personally loyal citizen armies that had fueled so much of the civil strife of the preceding century. He established Rome's first standing police and firefighting forces, reformed the administration of Rome's many provinces to reduce corruption and improve tax collection, and created an official imperial postal system to improve communication across the vast expanse of Roman territory. Perhaps most significantly for the future of the empire, Augustus worked carefully throughout his long reign to establish clear and orderly mechanisms for the succession of power after his own death. Recognizing that the greatest weakness of his new system lay in the question of what would happen when he himself was no longer alive to hold its various elements together. Though his own preferred heirs died before him one after another in a series of personal tragedies that deeply affected the aging emperor, Augustus eventually settled on his stepson Tiberius as his successor, ensuring that when Augustus finally died in 14 after Christ, power passed to a new emperor without triggering the kind of catastrophic civil war that had followed the death of Julius Caesar decades before. The Rome that Augustus left behind was, in nearly every meaningful sense, a fundamentally different society than the republic into which he had been born. Yet Octavian, having witnessed firsthand how his adoptive father's accumulation of visible autocratic power had led directly to Caesar's assassination, was determined not to repeat that same fatal mistake. Rather than declaring himself king, or even openly claiming the title of dictator that Caesar had held. Octavian instead engineered an extraordinarily clever political settlement, one that preserved the outward appearance and traditional institutions of the old republic: the Senate, the annual elected offices, the ancient ceremonies and titles, while quietly concentrating real substantive power in his own hands through a careful combination of formal legal authorities, personal wealth, and above all, his unrivaled control over the loyalty of Rome's legions. In 27 before Christ, in a carefully staged political ceremony, Octavian publicly offered to relinquish his extraordinary powers and restore full authority to the Senate and the Roman people. The Senate, as Octavian surely anticipated, refused this offer, instead granting him a series of special honors and titles, including the name by which history would remember him ever after: Augustus, a title carrying connotations of reverence, majesty, and semi-divine authority without ever explicitly claiming the forbidden title of king. This system of government, in which Augustus ruled as what historians now call a princeps, meaning first citizen, while maintaining the careful fiction that the republic continued to function as before, became known as the Principate, and it would provide the basic constitutional framework for Roman government for the next 3 centuries. The nearly 4.5 decades during which Augustus ruled Rome, from his final victory at Actium until his death in the year 14 after Christ, transformed nearly every aspect of Roman life. After more than a century of nearly continuous civil war, political violence, and social upheaval, Augustus brought Rome an extended period of internal peace and stability that his contemporaries and countless generations of historians afterward would come to know as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period that would ultimately extend, with only occasional interruptions, for roughly 2 centuries following Augustus's own reign. Augustus used this hard-won stability to reshape Rome in truly remarkable ways. He famously claimed with justified pride that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, referring to his extensive program of public building projects, temples, theaters, public baths, and grand public spaces that transformed the physical appearance of the city itself. He reformed the Roman military into a smaller, more professional, permanently standing force, with fixed terms of service and guaranteed retirement benefits, reducing the dangerous reliance on personally loyal citizen armies that had fueled so much of the civil strife of the preceding century. He established Rome's first standing police and firefighting forces, reformed the administration of Rome's many provinces to reduce corruption and improve tax collection, and created an official imperial postal system to improve communication across the vast expanse of Roman territory. Perhaps most significantly for the future of the empire, Augustus worked carefully throughout his long reign to establish clear and orderly mechanisms for the succession of power after his own death. Recognizing that the greatest weakness of his new system lay in the question of what would happen when he himself was no longer alive to hold its various elements together. Though his own preferred heirs died before him one after another in a series of personal tragedies that deeply affected the aging emperor, Augustus eventually settled on his stepson Tiberius as his successor, ensuring that when Augustus finally died in 14 after Christ, power passed to a new emperor without triggering the kind of catastrophic civil war that had followed the death of Julius Caesar decades before. The Rome that Augustus left behind was, in nearly every meaningful sense, a fundamentally different society than the republic into which he had been born. Political power now flowed from a single individual and his household, rather than from the collective deliberations of Senate and popular assembly. Even though the outward forms and titles of the old republic continued to be carefully maintained for generations afterward, allowing the Roman aristocracy to preserve at least the comforting illusion that their ancient traditions had survived intact. Beneath this careful facade, however, the age of the Roman emperors had begun in earnest, and the vast, diverse territories that made up the Roman world, stretching from Britain and Spain in the west to Syria and Egypt in the east, would spend the following centuries governed not by the shifting consensus of elected magistrates and senators, but by the personal will, wisdom, or, as later chapters of our story will reveal, sometimes the personal madness of a single ruling emperor. Having followed the grand sweep of kings, republics, generals, and emperors, let us now slow our pace and step down from the heights of political history into the crowded, noisy, fragrant, and often difficult streets of Rome itself, to imagine what daily life actually felt like for the ordinary people who lived within this vast empire during the height of its power and stability. By the time of the early empire, Rome had grown into a city of staggering size by ancient standards, home to perhaps 1 million people, a population so large that no other city in the Western world would match it again for well over 1,000 years. Imagine narrow streets barely wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, winding between tall apartment buildings called insulae, some rising 5 or 6 stories high, built quickly and often cheaply from wood and mud brick, structures so prone to collapse and fire that wealthy Romans avoided living in the upper floors whenever possible, leaving the cheapest, most dangerous, and most cramped quarters at the top of these buildings for the poorest residents of the city. Fire was a constant and genuine terror in ancient Rome, spreading rapidly through these densely packed wooden structures, and building collapse was common enough that the poet Juvenal, writing during this period, complained bitterly about landlords who patched cracks in crumbling walls with nothing more than a thin coat of plaster, while assuring frightened tenants that their homes were perfectly safe to sleep in. Water was carried into the city through an impressive network of aqueducts, engineering marvels that brought fresh water from springs and rivers sometimes dozens of miles away, flowing down through gentle, carefully calculated gradients into public fountains, baths, and the homes of wealthier citizens, while poorer residents typically had to collect their water from public fountains scattered throughout the city's various neighborhoods. The rhythm of a typical Roman day began early, often before sunrise. Since ancient artificial lighting provided by oil lamps and candles was expensive, dim, and generally reserved for necessity rather than convenience. Wealthy Roman citizens would often begin their morning with a ritual called the salutatio, receiving visits from clients, poorer or less powerful individuals who depended on a wealthy patron for financial support, legal assistance, or political favors in exchange for public displays of loyalty and support, a social relationship that formed one of the fundamental threads holding Roman society together at every level. From the humblest neighborhood relationships all the way up to the grandest political alliances between senators and emperors. Breakfast was typically a light affair. Bread, perhaps some cheese or fruit, eaten quickly before the day's business began. The main meal of the day, called cena, was generally eaten in the mid to late afternoon, and for wealthier Romans this meal could become an elaborate social occasion. Guests reclining on couches arranged around a central table, in the Roman fashion that had itself been adopted originally from Greek and Eastern Mediterranean dining customs, served multiple courses that might include eggs, seafood, roasted meats, and sweet dishes flavored with honey, since refined sugar was essentially unknown in the ancient Mediterranean world. For the ordinary poor of Rome, however, daily food was considerably simpler, based primarily around grain, typically consumed as bread or a thick porridge called pulse, supplemented with vegetables, olive oil, and occasionally cheap cuts of meat or fish when available. The Roman state itself took a direct interest in ensuring that Rome's urban poor had access to affordable grain, eventually establishing a system of free grain distribution to citizens, recognizing, quite pragmatically, that a hungry and desperate urban population posed a serious risk to political stability in a city where crowds could gather quickly and riots could erupt with little warning. Public bathing formed one of the great shared social experiences of Roman life, cutting across, at least to some degree, the sharp lines of wealth and social status that otherwise divided Roman society so thoroughly. The great public bath complexes, some of which could accommodate thousands of bathers at once, offered not merely bathing facilities, though these themselves were often architecturally spectacular, featuring elaborate systems of heated floors and walls called hypocausts that circulated hot air from underground furnaces, but also gymnasiums for exercise, libraries, gardens, and social spaces where Romans of various backgrounds might gather to relax, conduct business, gossip, or simply enjoy a few hours away from the crowded conditions of their own, often cramped living quarters. It is impossible to speak of daily life and entertainment in ancient Rome without addressing one of its most famous, and to modern sensibilities most disturbing institutions, the gladiatorial games. These contests, in which trained fighters, often slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, though sometimes also free men who volunteered for the profession in hopes of fame and fortune, fought one another sometimes to the death. In front of enormous cheering crowds, occupied a central and deeply significant place in Roman public culture for centuries. The origins of gladiatorial combat appear to lie in ancient Italian funeral rituals, in which combat between captives or slaves was performed as a kind of blood sacrifice to honor a deceased nobleman, a tradition that gradually evolved, particularly during the later Republic and throughout the imperial period, into elaborate public spectacles staged by wealthy politicians and eventually by the emperors themselves, who understood that providing the Roman public with free and spectacular entertainment was an enormously effective tool for building political popularity and demonstrating the wealth, power, and generosity of the game's sponsor. Gladiators typically trained in specialized schools, where they learned to fight according to specific standardized styles, each associated with particular weapons, armor, and fighting techniques. A retiarius, for example, fought with a weighted net and a trident, relying on mobility and reach to entangle and wound more heavily armored opponents from a distance, while a heavily armored secutor carried a short sword and a large shield, designed specifically to hunt down and overwhelm the more lightly equipped retiarius. In a dramatic contrast of fighting styles that Roman audiences found particularly compelling to watch. Contrary to a popular modern assumption, gladiatorial combat did not always end in death. Skilled gladiators represented a significant financial investment for their owners, who trained and equipped them at considerable expense, and a defeated gladiator who had fought bravely might well be granted his life by the crowd or by the game's sponsor, particularly if he had demonstrated courage and skill worthy of respect, even in defeat. The famous gesture of thumbs up or thumbs down, so familiar from later popular depictions of Roman games, likely bears little resemblance to whatever actual gestures Roman crowds and officials genuinely used to signal the fate of a defeated fighter, since ancient sources describing this practice are frustratingly vague and sometimes contradictory on the precise details. Successful gladiators remarkably could achieve a strange kind of celebrity status within Roman society, their images appearing on everything from decorative pottery to graffiti scrawled on the walls of Pompeii, where enthusiastic fans recorded their admiration for particular fighters in terms not entirely unlike how modern sports fans might celebrate a favorite athlete. Some gladiators, having earned enough fame, prize money, or the favor of a wealthy patron, could eventually earn their freedom, awarded a wooden sword called a rudis as a symbolic mark of their formal retirement from the arena. The grandest stage for these gladiatorial contests, and for a range of other public spectacles including staged animal hunts, and in the arena's earliest years even elaborately staged mock naval battles achieved by flooding the arena floor itself, was the great amphitheater that Romans knew as the Flavian Amphitheater, though history would eventually come to know it by a different and far more famous name, the Colosseum. Constructed under the Emperor Vespasian and completed under his son Titus in the year 80 after Christ, this enormous structure, capable of holding somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators, represented an extraordinary feat of Roman architectural and engineering achievement, featuring a complex system of underground chambers and elevators that could raise animals, scenery, and even gladiators themselves up through trapdoors directly into the arena floor, creating dramatic surprise entrances that must have astonished ancient audiences every bit as much as elaborate modern stage effects astonish audiences today. Admission to the Colosseum and to similar public spectacles across the empire was typically free for Roman citizens, funded by the enormous personal wealth of the emperors and by wealthy private citizens seeking public favor and political advancement. Reflecting the broader Roman political philosophy sometimes summarized by the phrase bread and circuses, the idea, articulated critically by the poet Juvenal, that Roman emperors maintained public order and political loyalty less through good governance in the abstract sense, and more through the practical strategy of keeping the urban population well fed and thoroughly entertained. Beyond the arena, Roman entertainment culture also embraced chariot racing, a sport that, if anything, generated even more passionate devotion among ordinary Romans than gladiatorial combat itself. Races were organized around several professional racing factions, each identified by a particular color, and Roman citizens followed their favored factions with an intensity that occasionally spilled over into serious civil unrest, most famously centuries later in a devastating riot in Constantinople that grew directly out of chariot racing rivalries and very nearly toppled an emperor from his throne. Beneath all of this public spectacle and daily routine lay the grim, foundational reality of Roman slavery, an institution so deeply embedded within nearly every aspect of Roman economic and social life that it is impossible to fully understand the ancient Roman world without acknowledging its scale and its human cost. Slaves performed labor across virtually every sector of Roman society, working the vast agricultural estates that had grown so significant during the late Republic, laboring in mines and workshops, serving as household servants, tutors, and skilled craftsmen within wealthier Roman homes, and as we have already discussed, sometimes fighting and dying within the gladiatorial arena itself for the entertainment of the very society that held them in bondage. The precise legal and social status of Roman slaves varied enormously depending on their particular circumstances. A highly educated Greek slave serving as a tutor or secretary within a wealthy household might enjoy a degree of comfort, respect, and even eventual freedom that stood in stark, brutal contrast to the fate of slaves condemned to labor and often die within the empire's mines or agricultural plantations. Manumission, the formal granting of freedom to a slave, was not uncommon, and freed slaves, called freedmen, could in some cases achieve considerable wealth and social standing, though they remained excluded from certain political and social privileges reserved exclusively for those born free. This complex, often deeply troubling tapestry of daily life, the crowded apartment buildings and grand public baths, the free bread and violent spectacles, the wealthy patrons and their dependent clients, and the vast, largely invisible labor of the enslaved that underpinned so much of Roman prosperity, together form the genuine texture of existence within the Roman world during the height of its power. A civilization capable of extraordinary engineering, art, and administrative sophistication, existing alongside forms of institutionalized cruelty and inequality that stand as a sobering reminder of how differently the ancient world understood concepts of human dignity and rights compared to how we understand them today. Beyond the arena and the bathhouse, ordinary commerce filled the streets of Rome with a constant, restless energy. Marketplaces such as the Great Forum itself and specialized markets scattered throughout the city's many neighborhoods bustled with vendors selling bread, olive oil, wine, fish brought fresh from the coast, pottery, textiles, and countless other goods, their cries mixing with the general noise of cartwheels grinding over paving stones, since heavy-wheeled traffic was in fact banned from central Roman streets during daylight hours by law, forcing much of the city's goods delivery into the noisy, sleepless hours of the night, a detail the poet Juvenal complained about bitterly, noting how difficult it was for an ordinary resident of Rome to find any real rest amid the endless rumble of cart traffic echoing through narrow streets after dark. Family life within Roman households followed patterns that would seem in some ways quite foreign to modern sensibilities. Marriages among the elite were frequently arranged for political or economic advantage rather than romantic affection, though evidence suggests that many Roman marriages nonetheless developed into genuine partnerships of mutual respect and even deep affection over time. Roman women, while excluded entirely from formal political participation and generally required to operate under the legal guardianship of a father or husband, nonetheless exercised considerable practical influence and authority within the household itself, managing domestic affairs, family finances, and, particularly among wealthier families, wielding real informal political influence through their family connections and personal relationships. Education for Roman children, at least among families who could afford it, typically began at home before progressing, for boys especially, to formal schooling that emphasized reading, writing, arithmetic, and eventually the study of rhetoric, considered an essential skill for any young man hoping to pursue a career in law, politics, or public administration. Girls from wealthier families sometimes received a broadly similar early education, though it was far less common and far less socially expected. For a young woman to continue into the more advanced stages of rhetorical training pursued by her male counterparts, since Roman society generally directed its educational investment toward the public careers that only men were permitted to pursue. Roman medicine, though limited by modern standards and often mixed with religious ritual and superstition, nonetheless achieved genuine sophistication in certain areas, particularly in the treatment of battlefield injuries, given the empire's near-constant need to treat wounded soldiers along its many frontiers. Roman military doctors developed effective techniques for wound cleaning, suturing, and even certain surgical procedures, while civilian medicine, often practiced by Greek-trained physicians who enjoyed considerable prestige within Roman society, drew heavily on the accumulated medical knowledge of the wider Greek and Eastern Mediterranean world that Rome had absorbed through its conquests. In the chapter that follows, we will return once more to the political heights of Roman power to examine several of the empire's most notorious and, in some cases, genuinely disturbed rulers. Emperors whose personal excesses, cruelty, and instability would become legendary even in their own time, testing the resilience of the imperial system that Augustus had so carefully constructed. For now, let the memory of crowded Roman streets, the steam rising from great public baths, and the roar of 80,000 voices echoing from the stone walls of the Colosseum settle quietly into memory. The daily texture of a civilization both magnificent and deeply flawed in equal measure. The system that Augustus so carefully built rested on a single fundamental assumption, that whoever inherited his position would govern with something approaching his own wisdom, patience, and self-restraint. History, unfortunately, does not always cooperate with such hopeful assumptions. And in the decades that followed the death of Augustus, Rome would discover just how dangerous its new system could become when supreme, essentially unchecked power fell into the hands of men whose personal character proved far less suited to the responsibilities of empire than that of its careful, calculating founder. Augustus was succeeded by his stepson Tiberius, an experienced and generally competent military commander who nonetheless grew increasingly withdrawn, suspicious, and reclusive as his reign progressed, eventually retreating almost entirely from the city of Rome itself to rule from the isolated island of Capri, leaving the actual administration of the empire increasingly in the hands of a powerful and much feared subordinate named Sejanus, whose own ambitions eventually led to his dramatic downfall and execution. Once Tiberius belatedly recognized the scale of the threat this trusted lieutenant had come to represent. Tiberius died in the year 37 after Christ, leaving behind a reputation for cruelty, paranoia, and increasingly bizarre personal behavior during his final years of isolated rule on Capri. Rumors that, whether entirely accurate or considerably exaggerated by hostile later historians, cast a dark shadow over the final years of his reign. Tiberius was succeeded by his great-nephew, a young man remembered by history under the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, a fond nickname originally given to him as a child when he had accompanied his popular military father on campaign. Dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform that delighted the legions who watched him grow up among their ranks. This early popularity meant that Caligula's accession to power in the year 37 was initially greeted with genuine enthusiasm and relief across the Roman world. Weary as many Romans had grown of the increasingly grim final years of Tiberius's reign. Whatever hopeful expectations the Roman people held for their charming young new emperor, however, would soon curdle into horror. According to numerous ancient sources, Caligula suffered a severe illness relatively early in his reign, and emerged from this sickness a dramatically transformed individual, exhibiting behavior that ranged from wildly extravagant to genuinely disturbing and, according to many ancient historians, outright insane. Whether Caligula's later reputation for madness reflects a literal medical or psychological condition, or whether it primarily reflects the hostile propaganda of later senators and historians who despised his autocratic style of rule, remains a matter of genuine historical debate. But the stories that survive from his reign remain among the most infamous in all of Roman history. Ancient sources describe Caligula ordering the execution of political rivals and even close family members on the flimsiest of pretexts, engaging in wildly extravagant personal spending that rapidly emptied the substantial financial reserves Tiberius had carefully accumulated, and demanding forms of personal reverence that pushed uncomfortably close to outright claims of divine status while he was still alive. A claim that deeply unsettled traditional Roman religious sensibilities, which generally reserved formal deification for emperors only after their death. Perhaps the most famous story associated with Caligula, though its historical accuracy remains genuinely disputed among modern historians, claims that he intended to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, to the position of Roman consul, an anecdote that, true or not, has come to symbolize the perceived absurdity and instability of his entire reign in popular historical memory. Caligula's increasingly erratic and tyrannical behavior eventually provoked exactly the kind of conspiracy that had claimed Julius Caesar nearly a century before. In the year 41 after Christ, members of his own Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit specifically tasked with protecting the emperor's personal safety, assassinated Caligula in a palace corridor, along with his wife and infant daughter, bringing his brief, chaotic reign to a violent end after less than 4 years in power. In the confused aftermath of Caligula's murder, the Praetorian Guard, searching the palace, reportedly discovered Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain, terrified that he too would be killed in the ongoing violence. Rather than executing this unlikely, physically awkward, and widely underestimated member of the imperial family, the guards instead proclaimed Claudius emperor, partly, according to ancient sources, because they recognized that his continued survival and cooperation could prove useful in securing their own future position and privileges under a new ruling emperor. Claudius, who had spent much of his earlier life dismissed by his own family as unfit for public office due to physical disabilities that caused him to walk with a limp and speak with a pronounced stammer, proved to be, somewhat surprisingly to his contemporaries, a genuinely capable and effective administrator during his own reign, overseeing the successful conquest of Britain, significant improvements to Rome's infrastructure and legal system, and generally more stable, competent governance than either his immediate predecessor, or, as we shall soon see, his eventual successor would provide. Claudius died in the year 54 after Christ, with some ancient sources suggesting he may have been poisoned by his own scheming wife Agrippina, eager to secure the throne for her son from a previous marriage rather than for Claudius's own biological son. That son of Agrippina, adopted by Claudius and groomed carefully for succession, was a young man who would become perhaps the single most notorious of all Roman emperors, remembered across the centuries that followed as a byword for tyranny, cruelty, and self-indulgent excess, the Emperor Nero. Nero's early reign, guided by capable advisors, including the famous philosopher Seneca, began reasonably well. But as Nero grew older and increasingly resentful of the constraints these advisors placed on his personal behavior, his rule descended into a pattern of extravagance, paranoia, and violence that would ultimately cost him both his throne and his life. Nero is remembered perhaps most famously for his association with the Great Fire that devastated much of Rome in the year 64 after Christ, a catastrophic blaze that burned for nearly a week and destroyed a significant portion of the city. Although the popular legend that Nero fiddled while Rome burned is almost certainly inaccurate, since the fiddle itself did not yet exist as a musical instrument in ancient Rome, and considerable evidence suggests Nero actually organized relief efforts and opened his own gardens to house those left homeless by the disaster. Rumors nonetheless spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire started, perhaps to clear space for an ambitious new palace complex he wished to build. Whether to deflect these damaging rumors or out of genuine independent hostility, Nero directed blame for the fire toward Rome's small Christian community, initiating a brutal wave of persecution that included horrific public executions, events that would leave a lasting mark on the early history of Christianity itself and on Nero's own enduring reputation for cruelty. Beyond the Great Fire, Nero's reign became increasingly notorious for a string of murders within his own family, including, according to most ancient sources, the killing of his own mother Agrippina, who had originally schemed so effectively to place him on the throne, and later the death of his wife, reportedly from injuries inflicted during a violent argument with Nero himself. Nero also devoted enormous personal attention and public resources to his own artistic pursuits, performing publicly as a singer and actor in a manner that many traditional conservative-minded Romans found deeply undignified for a man holding the supreme office of emperor, believing that public performance of this kind was appropriate only for professional entertainers of relatively low social status, not for the ruler of the Roman world. As Nero's personal excesses and political mismanagement mounted, military and political support for his continued rule collapsed rapidly. Provincial governors and military commanders began open rebellion, and facing the prospect of capture and a humiliating execution, Nero ultimately took his own life in the year 68 after Christ, reportedly uttering a final lament about what a great artist was being lost to the world in his death. His suicide brought an abrupt and violent end to the entire Julio-Claudian dynasty that had governed Rome since the days of Augustus himself, plunging the empire into a brief but intense period of civil war and instability, remembered by history as the Year of the Four Emperors, during which 4 different men claimed the imperial throne in rapid, bloody succession before a new and more stable dynasty finally managed to restore order. The stories of Caligula and Nero, whatever exaggerations later hostile historians may have added to their already troubling reputations, reveal something genuinely important about the fundamental vulnerability at the very heart of the imperial system that Augustus had so carefully constructed. A system of government that concentrated such enormous, essentially unchecked power in the hands of a single individual would always remain critically dependent on the personal character, wisdom, and self-restraint of whoever happened to occupy that singular position of authority. And history would demonstrate again and again across the following centuries of Roman imperial rule that this crucial dependence on individual character represented perhaps the single greatest structural weakness of the entire Roman imperial system. A weakness that would continue to produce both genuinely capable, wise rulers and, at other times, individuals whose personal instability or cruelty would bring real and lasting suffering to the vast empire they had been entrusted to govern. The pattern established by Caligula and Nero would unfortunately repeat itself more than once across the following centuries of Roman imperial history. Toward the end of the 1st century after Christ, the Emperor Domitian, though a capable administrator in certain practical respects, grew increasingly paranoid and authoritarian as his reign progressed, conducting purges of perceived enemies within the Senate and aristocracy that left the empire's ruling class in a state of constant anxiety, until Domitian too was ultimately assassinated by conspirators within his own palace household in the year 96 after Christ. His memory afterward formally condemned by a resentful Senate eager to erase the record of his suspicious, autocratic rule. Perhaps a full century later, the empire would witness yet another descent into imperial excess and instability under the Emperor Commodus, a man whose reign has become particularly well known in modern times through popular film and television depictions. Commodus, unlike his father, the widely respected philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, showed little genuine interest in the difficult, patient work of imperial administration, preferring instead to indulge his own personal obsession with gladiatorial combat, reportedly participating himself in staged, carefully rigged fights within the Colosseum, a spectacle that many traditional Roman aristocrats found deeply humiliating for a man holding the supreme office of emperor. Commodus, too, was eventually assassinated, strangled in his bath by a wrestler hired by conspirators within his own inner circle in the year 192 after Christ, plunging Rome once again into a brief but violent period of civil war and disputed imperial succession. In the chapter that follows, we will trace the long, gradual story of Rome's eventual decline, examining the complex combination of economic pressure, military crisis, political instability, and external invasion that would, centuries after the excesses of Nero and Caligula, finally bring the western portion of the Roman Empire to its historic end. For now, let the strange, unsettling memory of an emperor who reportedly wished to make his horse a consul, and another who believed himself a great artist even as his empire burned and rebelled around him, settle quietly into memory, a reminder of how fragile even the greatest and most carefully constructed systems of human power can prove to be when so much depends upon the character of the single person standing at their very center. No empire, however vast, however carefully constructed, endures forever. And the story of Rome's long, gradual decline offers one of history's most studied and most sobering examples of how even the mightiest civilizations can eventually falter, strain, and ultimately fracture under the accumulated weight of internal pressures and external threats. The fall of Rome did not happen suddenly in a single dramatic moment, but unfolded instead across several centuries through a complex, tangled combination of economic hardship, political instability, military crisis, and the gradual arrival of new peoples pressing against the empire's long, difficult-to-defend frontiers. The first truly severe warning sign of Rome's underlying vulnerabilities arrived in the middle of the 3rd century after Christ, during a period modern historians commonly call the crisis of the 3rd century, roughly spanning the decades between 235 and 284 after Christ. During this turbulent half-century, the Roman Empire experienced a bewildering, almost dizzying succession of emperors, more than 20 different men claiming the imperial throne within this relatively short period. Most of the military commanders raised to power by their own loyal legions, and most of them meeting violent ends at the hands of rival generals or their own mutinous soldiers within just a few years, or sometimes mere months, of taking power. This internal political chaos coincided with and was made significantly worse by mounting external pressures along nearly every one of Rome's frontiers simultaneously. In the east, a newly aggressive and reorganized Persian Empire ruled by the ambitious Sasanian dynasty inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on Roman forces, including the almost unthinkable capture of a reigning Roman emperor, Valerian, who was taken prisoner in battle and, according to later hostile Persian accounts, kept as a humiliated captive for the remainder of his life. Along the northern frontiers, various Germanic peoples, including groups the Romans knew as the Goths, the Alemanni, and the Franks, began launching increasingly frequent and destructive raids across the Rhine and Danube rivers, probing at Roman defenses that had once seemed nearly impenetrable. Compounding these military and political crises, the Roman economy itself began to suffer severe strain during this same turbulent period. Successive emperors, desperate to fund their armies and secure the loyalty of their soldiers amid constant civil war and external threats, resorted to debasing Rome's silver coinage, reducing the actual precious metal content of Roman currency, while maintaining its nominal face value, a practice that inevitably triggered serious inflation, undermining trade, savings, and general economic confidence throughout the empire. Remarkably, Rome managed to pull back from what might easily have become total collapse, largely through the efforts of a series of capable, battle-hardened soldier emperors who gradually restored military discipline, pushed back foreign invaders, and reunified the empire's temporarily fractured territories. The most significant of these restorative figures was the Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in the year 284 after Christ, and implemented a sweeping series of reforms explicitly designed to address the structural weaknesses that had nearly destroyed the empire during the preceding crisis. Diocletian's most significant and lasting reform involved a fundamental restructuring of imperial governance itself. Recognizing that the empire had simply grown too vast and its frontiers too extensive for any single ruler to effectively defend and administer alone, Diocletian established a system known to historians as the Tetrarchy, meaning rule by four, dividing supreme authority between two senior emperors, each bearing the title Augustus, and two junior emperors, each bearing the title Caesar, with each of these four rulers responsible for defending and governing a specific quarter of the vast Roman territories. While this particular four-way division of power would not survive intact for very long after Diocletian's own eventual retirement, a genuinely unprecedented choice for a reigning Roman emperor, the broader underlying principle it established, that the Roman Empire might function more effectively divided into Eastern and Western administrative halves, would prove remarkably durable and consequential for the remainder of Roman history. Diocletian also implemented sweeping economic and administrative reforms, attempting with only partial and temporary success to control the raging inflation that had plagued the empire through fixed price regulations, reorganizing provincial administrative boundaries to improve tax collection and governance, and significantly expanding the size of the Roman military to better defend the empire's long frontiers. Though this expansion came at a substantial and ultimately unsustainable long-term financial cost to the imperial treasury. Following Diocletian's eventual retirement, a fresh round of civil war erupted among rival claimants to imperial power, from which a single figure eventually emerged triumphant, the Emperor Constantine, whose reign would prove transformative for Roman history in ways that would echo for many centuries afterward. Indeed, in some ways, all the way into the modern world. Constantine's rise to sole power was itself dramatic, according to Constantine's own later account, on the eve of a decisive battle against a rival claimant at the Milvian Bridge near Rome in the year 312 after Christ. Constantine reported experiencing a vision instructing him to have his soldiers mark their shields with a Christian symbol before entering battle, a battle that Constantine subsequently won decisively. Whatever the precise nature of this reported religious experience, Constantine's subsequent reign marked an absolutely pivotal turning point in Roman religious history, ending centuries of intermittent persecution against Christians and instead extending official imperial tolerance and eventually active imperial favor and patronage toward what had previously been a relatively marginal, occasionally persecuted religious minority within the broader Roman world. Constantine's own eventual conversion to Christianity, along with his considerable political and financial support for the growing Christian church, set in motion a gradual but ultimately transformative religious shift that would, within just a few generations, see Christianity rise from a persecuted minority faith to become the official, dominant religion of the entire Roman Empire, fundamentally reshaping Roman culture, law, and identity in ways that would persist long after the political structures of the empire itself had disappeared. Constantine also made another decision of enormous long-term historical significance, establishing an entirely new imperial capital city on the site of an older Greek settlement called Byzantium, strategically located at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, along the narrow straits connecting the Mediterranean and Black Seas. This new city, which Constantine modestly named after himself Constantinople, would eventually grow into one of the greatest and most magnificent cities of the medieval world, and would serve as the capital of what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, the eastern portion of the old Roman world, which would remarkably continue to exist as a genuine, continuous Roman state for nearly another full millennium after the western half of the empire had already fallen. That western half of the Roman Empire, centered still on Italy and the city of Rome itself, faced mounting and ultimately insurmountable challenges throughout the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ. Economic resources, population, and crucially effective military manpower increasingly concentrated in the wealthier, more populous, and more easily defensible eastern provinces centered around Constantinople, while the western provinces struggled with declining tax revenues, increasingly difficult recruitment for the legions, and mounting pressure from various Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, peoples who were themselves in many cases being pushed westward by the movements of other groups migrating from further east, including most famously the fearsome Huns, a nomadic people whose westward expansion under leaders like the notorious Attila set off a chain reaction of population displacement that would ultimately prove catastrophic for Roman stability along its northern frontiers. The relationship between Rome and these various Germanic peoples was, throughout this final turbulent century of the Western Empire's existence, considerably more complicated than a simple story of barbarian invasion against a passive, purely defensive Roman state. Many Germanic groups initially sought not to destroy Rome, but rather to settle peacefully within its borders, seeking protection from other hostile groups pressing against them from further east, and Roman authorities frequently negotiated formal treaties allowing various Germanic peoples to settle within imperial territory in exchange for military service. Treaties that, however, proved difficult to maintain consistently amid ongoing Roman political instability. Periodic mistreatment of these settled populations by corrupt or hostile Roman officials, and repeated breakdowns of trust between Roman authorities and their nominal Germanic allies. One particularly consequential breakdown of this fragile relationship occurred when a large group of Gothic refugees, having been granted permission to settle within Roman territory along the Danube frontier while fleeing the advancing Huns, suffered severe mistreatment and exploitation at the hands of corrupt local Roman officials, provoking a Gothic uprising that culminated in a catastrophic Roman military defeat at the Battle of Adrianople in the year 378 after Christ. a battle in which a reigning Roman emperor, Valens, was himself killed on the battlefield along with a substantial portion of the Eastern Roman field army, a disaster from which Roman military strength in this crucial region never fully recovered. Perhaps the single most symbolically devastating moment in this long, gradual decline came in the year 410 after Christ, when a Gothic army under their king Alaric, after years of complicated negotiations, betrayals, and failed agreements with Roman authorities, finally entered and sacked the city of Rome itself, an event that sent profound psychological shockwaves throughout the entire Roman world. Although Rome had, by this point, actually ceased to function as the empire's primary political capital for some time, real imperial administration having shifted to other cities considered more strategically defensible, the symbolic significance of the ancient capital falling to a foreign army for the first time in nearly 8 centuries proved deeply, genuinely traumatic for Roman identity and confidence, prompting the great Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo to write his enormously influential work, The City of God, partly in response to pagan critics who blamed Rome's abandonment of its traditional gods for this unprecedented catastrophe. Over the following decades, the Western Roman Empire continued its long, painful process of territorial fragmentation, as various Germanic kingdoms, the Vandals in North Africa, the Visigoths in Spain, and eventually the Franks in Gaul, established increasingly independent and permanent kingdoms within what had once been unified Roman provincial territory, generally maintaining, at least initially, a nominal, largely symbolic acknowledgement of continued Roman imperial authority, while in practical terms governing these territories according to their own laws, customs, and increasingly independent political interests. The final formal end of the Western Roman Empire arrived not through a single dramatic climactic battle, but through what might almost be described as a quiet, administrative formality. In the year 476 after Christ, a Germanic military commander serving within the Roman army itself, a man named Odoacer, deposed the young, largely powerless Western Roman emperor, a boy ironically bearing the name Romulus Augustulus, combining the names of Rome's legendary founder and its first true emperor. And rather than claiming the imperial title for himself, Odoacer instead sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern emperor there as the sole remaining legitimate Roman ruler, while he himself governed Italy in practice as an independent king in all but name. This event, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, is conventionally marked by historians as the formal end date of the Western Roman Empire, though it is worth remembering that many people living through this transition may not have immediately recognized it as the dramatic historical turning point that later generations would consider it to be. Roman institutions, Roman law, Roman language, and Roman culture did not simply vanish overnight across the former Western provinces, but instead persisted, gradually transforming and blending with the customs of the various Germanic kingdoms that now govern these territories, laying the foundations for what modern historians call the early medieval period of European history. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople and what modern historians generally call the Byzantine Empire, though its own inhabitants continued to think of themselves quite genuinely as Romans throughout its entire remaining history, continued to exist as a real, functioning, continuous political state for nearly another full millennium, eventually falling only in the year 1453 after Christ, when Constantinople itself was finally captured by the expanding Ottoman Turkish Empire, bringing to a close what had been, by that final point, very nearly 2,000 years of continuous Roman political history, stretching all the way back to the legendary founding of the city beside the Tiber River with which our own story began. The reasons behind Rome's long, gradual decline in the West remain a subject of genuine scholarly debate even today. Historians have proposed dozens of contributing factors over the centuries: economic strain and unsustainable taxation, military overextension along impossibly long frontiers, political instability and recurring civil war. the corrosive effects of relying increasingly on foreign mercenary soldiers whose loyalty to Rome itself proved less reliable than that of earlier citizen legions, environmental and epidemiological factors including devastating plagues that repeatedly reduced Roman population and economic capacity, and the simple cumulative pressure of successive waves of migrating peoples pressing against increasingly overstretched and underfunded frontier defenses. Rather than any single decisive cause, most modern historians now generally understand Rome's fall as the product of numerous compounding pressures, each one making the others progressively more difficult and more costly for Roman authorities to successfully manage. What remains beyond any serious historical dispute, however, is the sheer scale and duration of Rome's civilization, and the extraordinary depth of its lasting influence on the world that followed it. Roman law continues to influence legal systems across much of the modern world. The Latin language that Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators carried across their vast empire evolved gradually into the modern Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people. Roman engineering achievements, roads, aqueducts, and architectural innovations in the use of concrete and the arch continue to influence builders and engineers for centuries afterward, and in many cases remain visible and even functional today, nearly 2,000 years after their original construction. And the Christian religion, which Constantine had once elevated from a persecuted minority faith to the favored religion of the Roman state, would go on to become one of the most influential religious and cultural forces in all of subsequent world history, carrying forward, in its own institutional structures and its own use of Latin as a language of scholarship and worship, distinct echoes of the ancient Roman world from which it had emerged. And so we come to the end of our long journey. From a handful of shepherds' huts beside the Tiber River, through the founding of a proud republic, the terror of Hannibal's elephants crossing the frozen Alps, the ambition of Caesar and the careful genius of Augustus, the excesses of mad emperors and the quiet daily rhythms of ordinary Roman life, all the way to the empire's long, gradual fragmentation and its eventual transformation into the foundations of medieval and ultimately modern Europe. Few civilizations in human history have left so deep, so lasting, and so far-reaching a mark upon the world that came after them, and fewer still offer so rich and instructive a story of ambition, achievement, excess, resilience, and eventual decline. A story that, even now, so many centuries later, continues to hold our attention and our imagination. Let this long, patient telling of Rome's rise and fall settle now quietly into rest. The wolf and the twins, the legions and the emperors, the marble columns and the crumbling frontiers, all gradually fading into the peaceful, distant hum of history, as we ourselves drift now toward a quiet and restful sleep. As our long journey through the story of Rome finally draws to its close, it is worth resting a while longer on the quiet, lasting echoes this ancient civilization left scattered throughout the modern world, echoes so deeply woven into our daily lives that we often walk past them without ever noticing they are there at all. Consider for a moment the words we use every single day. If you speak English, nearly a third of your vocabulary traces its roots back to Latin, arriving sometimes directly and sometimes through French, itself simply Latin that gradually evolved and changed shape over many centuries of use among the descendants of Roman Gaul. Words like justice, senate, republic, and even the very word empire itself all drift back across 2,000 years to the language once spoken in the Roman Forum. And if you happen to speak Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, or Romanian, you are, in a very real sense, speaking a living descendant of Latin itself, the language of Roman soldiers, merchants, and poets, transformed gradually over centuries by the many peoples who once lived within Rome's vast borders. Consider, too, the buildings that surround us. Every time an architect designs a dome, a rounded arch, or a building supported by columns arranged in the classical style, they are drawing, whether consciously or not, on architectural principles first perfected by Roman engineers 2,000 years ago. The very concrete used to build modern highways, bridges, and skyscrapers owes its existence to Roman experimentation with volcanic ash and lime, a building material so effective that certain Roman structures, including the great dome of the Pantheon in Rome itself, still stand today, remarkably intact, nearly 2,000 years after their original construction, outlasting countless buildings made with far more modern materials in the centuries since. Our systems of law and government, too, carry deep and lasting Roman fingerprints. The basic idea that laws should be written down clearly and apply equally to all citizens, rather than existing only as the unpredictable whim of a ruler, traces directly back to the ancient 12 tables displayed publicly in the Roman Forum. Modern legal concepts such as the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, the idea of a contract as a binding legal agreement between parties, and even the basic structure of a republic itself, with elected representatives, separated powers, and checks designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much unchecked authority, all draw, directly or indirectly, on foundations first laid by Roman statesmen more than 2,000 years ago, and later studied intensely by the founders of many modern nations, including those who wrote the constitutions of countries founded far across the ocean from Rome itself, many centuries after the Western Empire had already fallen. Even our calendar, the very way we measure and organize the passage of days, months, and years, remains fundamentally the calendar reformed by Julius Caesar so many centuries ago, later adjusted only slightly under Pope Gregory to correct a small accumulated drift in its measurement of the solar year. The names of several of our months still honor Roman gods and emperors directly: July for Julius Caesar himself, August for his heir Augustus, and several others drawing on the names of Roman deities whose worship once filled temples across the ancient Mediterranean world. And the Christian Church, which Constantine first elevated from a persecuted minority faith to the favored religion of the Roman state, carried forward in its own institutional structure, its use of Latin as a language of scholarship and worship for many centuries afterward, and even in the title of its highest bishop, the Pope, whose official residence remains within the city of Rome itself to this very day. A living continuation of certain threads connecting the ancient Roman world directly to our own modern age. Perhaps what remains most remarkable about Rome, when we finally step back from the details of consuls and emperors, legions and gladiators, is simply the extraordinary duration of its story. From the legendary founding beside the Tiber River to the final fall of Constantinople, Roman civilization, in one form or another, endured for well over 2,000 years, a span of time so vast that it becomes genuinely difficult for the human mind to hold its full scale in comfortable perspective. Empires rose and fell around Rome throughout this immense span. Persian kings, Hellenistic successors to Alexander the Great, and countless smaller kingdoms and tribal confederations, nearly all of them appearing and disappearing while Rome, in some form, continued on. This is perhaps the quiet lesson history offers us as we finally allow this long story to rest. Civilizations rise through patience, adaptability, and the willingness to learn from failure rather than being destroyed by it, just as early Rome rebuilt itself again and again after the sack by the Gauls, after the disaster at Cannae, after the crisis of the 3rd century. And civilizations fall in the end, not usually through any single dramatic blow, but through the slow, gradual accumulation of pressures left unaddressed for too long. Economic strain, political division, and the quiet erosion of the shared trust and common purpose that once bound a people together. As we let this story finally fade into rest, let the wolf and the twins, the legions marching along their stone-paved roads, the marble columns catching the last golden light of a Mediterranean sunset, and the quiet, patient endurance of a civilization that shaped so much of the world we live in today. Settle gently into memory and let your own mind now drift slowly and peacefully toward a deep and restful sleep.